Dr. Palmer has had a long history of involvement in art history and history on a wider scale. She has worked on collections in the National Gallery of Australia and the Ballarat Art Gallery, and no doubt many others, but they're the two that I can identify. She's published widely, and in doing so has shown a particular recognition of past art historians, such as Bernard Smith, who's she's currently working on his biography. Bernard Smith is recognised as the father of Australia's art history. Sheridan is a fellow of the Australian Centre at the University of Melbourne and an honorary associate at the La Trobe University. The presentation today is entitled Cultural Transformation in Post-War Melbourne, which I'm sure will appeal to all of us, and that's why we have so many people here today to enjoy Graduate House hospitality. So with that small introduction, I'd like to welcome Sheridan to the rostrum. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And hello, everyone. Can you all hear me? Only just. Is that better?
Yes.
I'd like to cover some of the more significant cultural changes that occurred in post-war Melbourne, especially where the exchanges between European artists and intellectuals with Australia's own cultural leaders expanded our cultural landscape. This was a period when many European refugees and immigrants arrived in Australia and introduced the modern in art, architecture, literature and education. Indeed, it was a period where the arts and education were reassessed, remodelled or reinvented, which brought Australia more in line with international standards and strengthened its post-war multiculturalism. In the years leading up to the Second World War, there was, despite an overwhelming conservatism in Australia, a radical undercurrent detectable amongst young artists and intellectuals, and especially so in Melbourne. They wanted to liberate aesthetics and ideas, but as the modernist architect Robin Boyd declared, conservative Australia knew what it wanted. It did not want change. Melbourne had an intellectual toughness where conflicts between ideas, individuals and institutions were often sharpest and most bitter, quite different to Sydney. Within such a climate of debate, there will always be action and change. Moreover, Melbourne's conservative and patriarchal climate helped to define exactly where the cultural deficiencies lay, and this provided a direction to the more progressive modernists, such as Arthur Boyd, Sidney Nolan, Albert Tucker, Noel Coonahan, or John and Sunday Reid of Heidi. As Melbourne's young artists and intellectuals responded to the tragic changes occurring during World War II, their work reflected the tumultuous outside world as much as their own sense of isolation and need for change. They embraced the new modernist ideas and European values that came through literature and from European refugee intellectuals and artists who had begun to arrive around 1937. Amongst the more notable émigrés was an Italian called Gino Nibbi, a crucial presence in the art and literary world from the early 1930s through to the post-war period. Nibbi challenged the cultural world of Melbourne through his articles and also with an engagement and criticism of certain aspects of middle-class Australia. He had arrived in Melbourne in 1928, escaping Mussolini's increasing domination, and he established the Leonardo Art Shop at 170 Little Collins Street, where he sold quality Australian and international literature, books, reproductions, postcards. Writing to an Italian friend in 1929, Gino Nibbi described his experience of Melbourne, and I quote, "I've become a vendor of paintings. I sell Matisse, Cézanne, Van Gogh. Ah, but alas, only copies. However, I impose my taste upon the poor and millionaire alike, and if I pursue this tack, Australia will fully be occupied with discussion about modern Impressionist art in a few years' time." End quote. By 1940, Nibbi's bookshop was no oasis for artists, writers, and Europhiles thirsting for material and information on international art and literature. Regular customers to his favourite art and literary salon included avant-garde and traditional painters, writers, academics, and musicians such as Arthur Boyd, Ian Fairweather, Sidney Nolan, John Percival, Albert Tucker, Vasiliev, as well as Alan McCulloch, Vance and Nettie Palmer, George Bell, Rupert Bunny, Ursula Hoff, Darrell and Lionel Lindsay, Keith Murdoch, Bernard Smith, John Reed, and the musicians, Hepzibah Menuhin and Percy Granger. For Albert Tucker, Nibbi, who came from the outside, instantly saw the state of Australian painting and what it needed, so he fulfilled that need. His kind of European sophistication was immensely valuable. Gino Nibbi obsessively compared contemporary Australian cultural and political values with that of Europe, and this gave artists grappling with the notion of an Australian style and identity a more tangible framework to work with. But there were several Australian men and women who were also important in turning the tide against the conservative climate in Melbourne. Basil Burdett was one of the more astute and active agents working for cultural renewal. Sorry, I've completely forgotten about my PowerPoint. How do I shift it along? Sorry? This one? Now that is a portrait of Gino Nibbi in the 1940s in his Leonardo art bookshop. And Gino Nibbi and his wife a bit earlier. I apologise for the not very good images, but there aren't many of Gino and his wife, Elvira. You probably all know this one, or know of him. Now, Basil Burdett was a well-informed art collector, critic and friend of Sir Keith Murdoch. This is Sir Keith Murdoch, who saw the prospect of a revitalised Australian culture based upon a diverse ethnographic mix, a melting pot that Australia would inevitably become if the diaspora from Europe gathered momentum. He is best remembered for organising the important Herald exhibition of French and British contemporary art held in the Melbourne Town Hall in October 1939 and sponsored by Sir Keith Murdoch. Burdett borrowed from private, public and commercial collections in England, France as well as in Australia. And he had met artists on the continent such as Léger, Vlaminck and the greatest legend in Paris, Pablo Picasso. The exhibition that Burdett organised gave Australian artists and the public a chance of visually engaging with post-impressionist and modern paintings on a scale not experienced before. But Sir Keith Murdoch's role in the cultural transformation of Australia, both pre- and post-war, was also very important. He supported individuals with progressive ideas, as well as transplanting the American ethos that culture was an important part of a nation's power, wealth and civilised position. His attraction to the National Gallery of Victoria was predicated on patronage as a powerful tool and of art as an elevating experience. Murdoch anointed Burdett as his cultural reformer, as I've said, but Burdett was killed in 1942 in the war. He would have been a contender for the directorship of the National Gallery of Victoria, but instead, Murdoch persuaded Darrell Lindsay to accept the position of keeper of prints and curator of the Art Museum. And this is when, of course, it was situated in Swanston Street. Now, Darrell Lindsay did become director in 1941, and he was fully aware of the need and importance of art curators, whose intellectual and cultural qualifications validated major collections in terms of scholarship and authentication. When he discovered that a German émigré, Dr. Ursula Hoff, was living and working in Melbourne, in fact she was the secretary at the Women's College here at the University of Melbourne, Lindsay immediately went about employing her at the National Gallery of Victoria. This appointment broke new ground in Australia, as she was the first qualified art historian to work in a state gallery and also the first female curator. Lindsay not only valued Hoff's extensive knowledge of continental and British art and scholarship and her international connections, but he conceded that she was the only scholar at the gallery who really knew about the great art of the past, and he consulted and referred many things to her. At the beginning of 1948, sorry, that was Darrell Lindsay, at the National Gallery, in front of a very, very important Flemish portrait of a lady. And this is Dr. Ursula Hoff, when she was very young and newly appointed to the National Gallery as the keeper of prints and drawings. And here we come to Joseph Burke. At the beginning of 1948, Joseph Burke became the inaugural Herald Professor of Fine Art. He wrote to the distinguished British art historian Sir Kenneth Clarke, describing Australia as, I quote, the Cinderella of the Dominions. The implication being that the country, its people and culture was in urgent need of refinement. Joe Burke believed that a visit from someone with a cultural pedigree such as Sir Kenneth Clarke's would be just the thing to get things moving in the Antipodes. There was still this very much view that Australia was the poor cousin. What Burke hadn't acknowledged was the considerable impact that émigré and refugee scholars and artists had already made here. By 1948, a small established group of Europeans had made significant inroads on the cultural activity in Australia. In Melbourne, the artists Danila Vasiliev and Josel Bergner, who had arrived separately in 1937, were amongst the first Europeans, apart from Gino Nibbi, to radically impress many of the younger modern artists such as Albert Tucker, Joy Hester, Arthur Boyd, John Percival, Sidney Nolan, Noel Coonahan, and the older George Bell. Bell wrote of Vasiliev's art as an oasis in the desert of painting to which we have become accustomed. Now Basil Burdett, Adrian Lawler, Vance and Nettie Palmer, John and Sunday Reid and Clive and Janet Neal, who had established the progressive education school Coonong out at Warrandyte, were other notable critics, writers and educationalists to embrace or employ European émigrés and refugees. Vance Palmer noted that Vasiliev's art and vitality were an exciting awakening. And the young, shy Jewish refugee from Poland, Josel Bergner, brought a different orientation to his view of Melbourne. His art drawing attention to the inner urban life. Where Vasiliev's portrait portrayed the play of children in the slums of Fitzroy, Bergner's sense of universal humanitarianism and his own experience of being a stateless refugee acknowledged the melancholic poverty of the working classes and the dispossessed Aboriginals. Their art could be said to have given an image to the Australian social conscience, and it immediately appealed to the socialists and the communists and the people of the left, who were clearly very concerned with humanitarian problems at the time. Many German or Austrian emigres and refugees who arrived in Australia had been beneficiaries of Germany's first democracy, the Weimar Republic. Between 1919 and 1933, groundbreaking scientific experimentation, just think of Einstein, revisionist philosophies, think of Freud and Jung, and a proliferation of talented avant-garde intellectuals, photographers and artists rejected traditional values and replaced them with a new, revolutionised modern life. The defeat of the Weimar Republic in 1933 by the Nazis saw the immediate expulsion and exile of its most prominent leaders, many of whom were Jewish. And it was these refugees who, through forced displacement, provided the catalysts so needed for the extraordinary cultural transformations in the foreign societies to which they fled. While America most benefited from the absorption of these influential refugees, creating a relocated base for economic and cultural wealth, Australia was profoundly transformed by its own small contingent of dismissed scholars and artists. The German photographer Wolfgang Sievers arrived in Melbourne in 1938. Urged to get out of Germany before war was declared, he'd been able to send out his most professional photographic equipment and some of his treasured personal belongings. He promptly established a fully equipped photographic studio in Toorak Road and secured important industrial assignments well before war was declared in September 1939. During the post-war period, Sievers and émigré architects and photographers were highly sought after, particularly by Melbourne architectural firms. In 1950, Sievers was commissioned by the Department of Overseas Affairs to photograph major industries around Australia that represented the dramatic growth and prosperity of the country. Comelco, Alcoa oil refineries, sulfuric acid industrial plants, established wineries, and the uranium and steel industries became the subject of his lens. Sievers' photographs also illustrated the clean design of machines and modern buildings. That's not Sievers, that's actually Helmut Newton. I'm not sure how I got that. What have I done now? Yes. Oh, that's Sievers, one of Sievers' amazing photographs of the industrial landscape at the time. His work brilliantly utilised the photographic methods he'd learned at the Berlin Contemporary School of Fine Arts in the 1930s, which had become the successor to the Bauhaus. Sievers was also one of the first to witness and document the rape of the land and dispossession of the indigenous people by the mining companies, and eventually he refused photographic industrial commissions, becoming instead a major activist for humanitarian issues. Sievers and the refugee photographers Helmut Newton, this is Helmut Newton's work, Henry Talbot and Mark Strizik became instrumental in reshaping Australia's industrial, cultural and national image with their sophisticated photographic vision. With an emphasis on modernism in architecture, new functional buildings began to flourish. The Newburn Flats in Queen's Road, South Melbourne, by the émigré Frederick Romberg, was the first concrete building in Australia. Romberg had been a student of Walter Gropius's in Zurich and swiftly established a reputation in Melbourne. Other examples of the new streamlined post-war architecture are Wilson's Hall at the University of Melbourne, built in 1956, or the old Royal Melbourne Hospital, the Heidelberg Military Hospital, or the Repatriation Hospital as we know it, the Olympic swimming pool, which has been dismantled, and numerous office, residential and industrial buildings and factories which still stand throughout Australia today. At this time, sculpture began to assume a certain concordance with these new buildings and their public spaces. In 1956, Arthur Boyd completed his ceramic totem pole for the Olympic swimming pool, and this can be seen today outside the Lexus building over near the big dome buildings. Brian Lewis, who was head of the University of Melbourne School of Architecture, promoted this new modern sculpture, and 2 exhibitions, which included sculptures by Inga King, Julius Cain, Clifford Last and Norma Redpath, were put on at the university. Now, Inga King had trained at the Academy of Art in Berlin, the Royal Academy in London and the Glasgow School of Art, with a brief stint in America before arriving in Melbourne in 1951. Inga King found she had a ready market, not so much for her sculpture, but for her jewellery. And this is Bambi Smith modelling Inga King's jewellery circa 1952. Absolutely stunning jewellery. However, King emerged as one of the most exciting abstract post-war sculptors working in fabricated welded steel, of which you can see one that sits between the National Gallery Victoria and the Performing Arts Centre, the big black waves. And she said that she was forced to look to working in welded steel because of the shortage of seasoned wood in Australia. And I think this sort of tends to reinforce that we really are quite a young country in many ways. The textile and industrial designer Gerhard Herbst, the graphic designer Gert Selheim, the furniture designers and manufacturers Schulung Krimper, Fred Lowen of Fleur Furniture and Ernst Rodeck were immediately active in the commercial world of Melbourne, bringing quality furniture that is now highly sought after by collectors. Erwin Rado was a first-rate concert pianist who arrived in Melbourne in 1939. After the war, he accompanied leader singers on the ABC radio and later became the dominant figure in the Melbourne Film Festival. The ballet impresario Edvard Borovansky arrived in 1930 and elected to stay rather than return to his Nazi-occupied country. He is acknowledged as the man who made Australian ballet. The sculptors Karl Duldig and his wife Slava, Andor Matsaris, whose son is commissioned to do a sculpture for this graduate union, Tina Venscher, Anne Graham, established a teaching and studio careers in the fine arts. Matsaris designed some of the decimal currency in 1961. The German artist and Bauhaus educationist Ludwig Hirschfeld Mack, a De Niro prisoner of war, as was a number of the other people I have mentioned, was appointed as the art master at Geelong Grammar School and revolutionised the teaching of art to a generation of boys. Berlin-born Felix Werder became the Age music critic from 1959 to 1977 and advocated a more liberalised music climate, pressing for a greater modern musical repertoire both on radio and in live performance. And he taught comparative arts at the Council of Adult Education for almost 40 years. Peter Herbst became Professor of Philosophy at the Australian National University in 1963, but in 1944 he was Arthur Boyd's and John Percival's business partner in the Arthur Merrick Boyd pottery shop at Murrumbina, which produced utilitarian ware to supply a post-war demand. I've forgotten a few more pictures. No, I haven't. Dr. Leonard Adam. Dr. Leonard Adam was released from internment camp prematurely due to his scholarly eminence and appointed to a position in the history department here at Melbourne University. Born in Berlin and partly Jewish, Adam had studied ethnology, economics, law, sinology, eventually becoming a chief judge and a reader in primitive law. He taught at German and British universities, and at the time of his deportation, again on the Danira, from England, Penguin Books had just published his book titled Primitive Art. In 1943, the National Gallery and the Museum of Victoria hosted Adam's Primitive Art exhibition, which threw an important focus on Indigenous culture that had hitherto been regarded in Australia as subcultural. Darryl Lindsay, the director of the National Gallery of Victoria, declared, by exhibiting Aboriginal material amongst worldwide examples of primitive art, Adam enhanced the profile of Australia's own Indigenous art. Moreover, it stimulated amongst the young art critics and artists, particularly Albert Tucker, which reinforced Tucker's compulsive interest in the primitive and primal forces of man and influenced his Images of Modern Evil series, which coincided with the Second World War. And this is one of Tucker's paintings titled Spring at Fitzroy. The years following World War II saw a wave of reconstruction and the promise of a new world order. This was true in Australian education, and art scholarship was reinvigorated at secondary and tertiary levels. The Chair of Fine Arts at the University of Melbourne was one of the more ambitious concepts for tertiary education. Again, Sir Keith Murdoch came to the rescue with an endowment of £40,000 in 1945. The appointment of Joseph Burke was the perfect choice. His dedication to the arts, his civic conscience and academic duties undisputedly made him one of the most influential and popular men in Melbourne and beyond. Burke had known from his student years at the University of London, of London's Courtauld Institute, of the importance and usefulness of continental scholars in the reform of British cultural and intellectual programs. When he commenced at the university and discovered a number of émigré scholars close at hand, he immediately enlisted Ursula Hoff, who was by then employed at the National Gallery of Victoria, and also the refugee Viennese art historian Franz Philipp, onto his staff. With these two European scholars and their impressive intellectual qualification, Burke was assured of meeting international standards of art historical education, and it gave the public and students intellectual opportunities rarely offered in Australia. Now, one of Burke's first major speeches, given at the inaugural general meeting of the newly formed National Gallery Society on the 9th of October 1947, showed vision and enthusiasm. This vision may have seemed fanciful in post-war Melbourne, but his concepts would become indispensable to many institutions. And now I'm going to read you a rather long quote, but it is an extraordinary piece of foresight. Burke told his audience, and I quote, "We live in an age of doubt and short returns, in which not only individuals but nations think in terms of 5-year plans. If that had been the spirit of the past, the world today would not possess a single Gothic cathedral. This society has noble aims, which stretch far into the future. Its purpose is to serve as a link between the gallery and the community, to bring into its service all those who have anything to contribute, whether by gifts or special knowledge or voluntary service. A museum is not simply a national treasure house in which valuable objects are preserved and guarded, and which the more curious members of the public inspect. It's an educational centre and a source of recreation. It is a publishing house which provides literature on the arts of all description, from the twopenny postcard to the sumptuous catalogue. An information centre, a workshop for art students, and a playground for art lovers. The museums and galleries of the future should not only be housed in buildings of unsurpassed beauty, they should be places where things happen, where concerts are given, where the man in the street and his family should feel at home and be encouraged to seek mental refreshment. Many people have to travel long distances. They should be able to get a good meal, quickly served in pleasant surroundings. I should like to see a children's museum, and even prepared to go farther and suggest that there should be a nursery where the overworked and harassed mother could leave her children for a little while and then renew contact with a world of imagination that gives dignity and beauty to life. End of quote. I think most of those things that Burke has suggested have been fulfilled. Even more European refugees applied for entry into Australia and were accepted in the 1950s, with immigration opened up to skilled labour and mass muscle power. Think of the snowy mountains, hydroelectric thing. The decade of the 1950s has often been described as a cultural intermission, yet it was actually one of Australia's most exciting revisionist phases. Sorry, that was Franz Philipp, who was employed at this university under Burke. Certainly early in the 1950s, Australia was as unsure of itself, and this reflected the mood of the Cold War. In comparison to the intensity of the 1940s, when the most adventurous art had a sort of wildcat spirit, and this is why I've thrown in this John Percival painting, Boy with Cat. After 1946, art and culture was replaced by a more domestic orientation, primarily as a way of normalising civilian life after the war, but also as a means of returning women to the home. During the war, civilian women were called into skilled and unskilled occupations, with female labour reaching a peak in 1944, constituting some 25% of the total workforce. Chris Wallace Crabb remembers the 1950s as being, a quote, a man's world. Women belonged to another sphere as a rule. But there were exceptions. Helen Ogilvie managed the upstairs area of Stanley Coe's interior design shop at 435 Burke Street, where she worked very hard at representing established and emerging artists, and successfully developed a market for modernist art. And when I'm talking about modernist art, I'm talking about John Brack, Arthur Boyd, Sidney Nolan, Inga King, so forth. This, in many ways, this successfully developed a market for modernist art. And this new aesthetic consumerism produced a new breed of patron or collector, many from a new generation of businesswomen and men, particularly David and Alan Wynne of Wynvale Wines, or Margaret Carnegie. The Australian Galleries in Collingwood opened in 1956 and is still going very strong. And contemporary artists began their transformation with the new post-war prosperity. Even the Australian Women's Weekly elevated its gendered face by challenging the only other major national portrait prize in Australia, the Archibald, with its own portrait prize worth £1,500. Importantly, it gave female artists recognition with £500 awarded for the best portrait by a woman painter. And the recently arrived Viennese artist Judy Kassab was to win this section. The post-war emphasis on improved conditions for the family also promoted art and culture as an accessible commodity, and the Herald Outdoor Art Show in the Fitzroy Gardens advocated a democratic view of art. Its aims, as Joseph Burke, who was actually one of the organisers of that Herald Art Show, wrote, "The prejudice that art is an expensive luxury reserved for the rich was broken down. Many found that they could afford to buy an original artwork for the first time." Amongst the Australian artist who began to capture the changing mood of the 1950s was John Burke. His paintings, drawings and prints of the 1950s appeared to satirise Australian suburbia or the conformity of city workers and pub drinkers, but it was his combination of social realism, symbolism, and his critical dissection of society at this time that exposed men and women within what is called the labour of existence. Arthur Boyd focused more on family life as well, including his making utilitarian pottery. So again, this reinforces the return to a more domestic view of the new Australian post-war family. By the 1950s, the focus on the environment and its unique light and colours was a considerable part of post-war aesthetics, and neo-impressionism, only this time it was not about the heroism of Australia's working men and women captured by the Heidelberg painters of the 1880s. Rather, it was a new national quality where Australian artists sought out subject matters in the great deserts, including Aboriginal art and culture. It was a decade of establishing Australia as a place. Arthur Boyd's evaluation of Australian art, that's Arthur Boyd making his pots. Arthur Boyd captured this essential quality, saying there is a sort of gaucheness, a toughness, almost a rawness about Australian painting. It's not provincial in the sense that Australian painters are not aware of what's going on overseas. There's a sort of lack of finesse, which is a good thing. The vastness of the rural outback landscapes and virgin bushlands was captured by Fred Williams, Clifton Pugh, Russell Drysdale, Sidney Nolan. The English art critic John Berger felt that there was a collective spirit that is typically Australian and which holds its own both literally and metaphysically. The alliance of art, culture and education and politics became a defining amalgam of the 1950s. At the University of Melbourne, Joseph Burke, Franz Philipp and Ursula Hoff were buoyed by their successful creation of the School of Fine Arts. Their teaching was an essential component of Australia's transformation at this most complex and culturally rich periods. Robin Boyd, the architect, believed that Australia during the 1950s was emerging from its cultural intermission and becoming increasingly well placed within the new world as a revitalised cultural state. He attributed this to the new salutary modernism espoused by émigré architects, craftsmen, artists and intellectuals, and its immediate acceptance by local professionals. And I'll end with just one final quote from Robin Boyd. "I deny suggestions that we are so handicapped by physical isolation and a small population, or that our public consists of sports-mad featherbrains so apathetic to cultural activity that a sincere artist must starve. I believe that Australians are no more or no less interested in and capable of appreciation of subtlety and imagination in the visual arts than the people of any other country. I do believe that Australia, with its high standard of education and living, today offers one of the greatest fields for artistic creation in the world. Thank you very much.
So Sheridan's happy to have a few questions. Yes, Margaret?
Thank you. I was just going to say that, perhaps I'll stand up, Margaret Mayers, that Herald art show that was sponsored by not Rupert, Keith Murdoch. Of course, at the war came just as we had seen the whole the Dali and the clock and the whole business. The tragedy was that we bought a couple of vuillards for the NGVI, as it is now, and the rest went into sort of hibernation here in Australia and was returned. We could have bought Van Goghs, the whole lot. I wish we'd had a more outlooking view of art, and perhaps Menzies and his idea of gum trees and Impressionism. We would have had a wonderful collection. But thank you so much for your talk. It was lovely to revisit the 50s. Thank you very much.
Yes, that was an interesting exhibition because not only there was, I think, another agenda to that exhibition, because many of the major cultural repositories in France and Europe were getting increasingly worried about their collections, so they actually sent out to Australia as a safe haven. And now, interestingly, the same thing was happening here, because the National Gallery of Victoria did an inventory of their crown jewels, so to speak, and then those works were actually also relocated to places like Ballarat Fine Art Gallery or Ercildown and many others, or even the Bendigo Jail, where paintings were put into cells, which nobody bothered to really go and check on, and there was a lot of dampness. So these paintings finally came back after the war and had to be conserved and repaired. But you know, this fear that we were going to be attacked, particularly after the Japanese invasion, meant that we were repeating exactly the same thing that Europe had been doing, that the National Gallery in London had done with sending all of their treasures to the Welsh slate mines and the great country houses. So it's you know, and these things will continue forever to be the same. If there are any major threats again, every major institution like the National Gallery of Victoria, London National Gallery, they all have their backup systems.
What a wish list we could have had if we'd only had enough foresight.
Very missed opportunity.
Insured it and kept it in Australia during the war.
Yes.
I don't want to command everything to the wrong, in the wrong sense. The doctor, I think she says quite correctly what she's saying, and I would not ask the wrong thing about here. I suggest many things that she mentioned are worthwhile. Are they not worthwhile?
Sorry, I didn't quite no.
I think the answer is probably yes.
Yes.
Bruce, thank you very much.
Yes.
Another question, please? Yes, Anne?
Do you see, how would you see the future of Australian art, where we now perhaps 2 or 3 generations on for that, and big name at the moment is Ben Quilty, is that leading us into an essentially Australian art that's a bit more emboldened than it has been?
I think Australian art tends to ebb and flow. We've been through our internationalising in the 70s, even in the 60s and the 70s, when we had 2 huge exhibitions at the National Gallery of Victoria called The Field and 2 decades of American art. And the emphasis then was on our Australian artists to start painting the way Americans did. By the 1980s, we were starting to magpie here, there and everywhere. I think there is now something of a return to more an Australian idiom, But of course you have to remember that since the 1950s, the post-war period, we've become very multiculturalised. We live in a global world now, but that's not to say that we cannot still look to what we are producing here that is distinctive. And I think that is what probably is a very significant aspiration amongst many artists. But there will be always young artists who will want to not be pigeonholed by a country or culture, and they aspire to a much more conceptualised approach to it, which is as valid. But I mean, we've had a lot of artists painting Antarctica, for example, and that is almost something like a stateless continent. You know, you don't have people marching around with their flags, generally speaking. You are more concerned with the fragility of an environment, and that is so overwhelming. So I think sometimes when the world starts becoming a very frightening place, and I guess we're experiencing that now with the economic downturn and problems, you start becoming much more close to your own home, your own land, your own culture. This may well, I think, invite artists, young artists, to reflect more on where they are, who they are, and where they may have to stay because, you know, they can't afford to go and live or travel as they once were able to.
One last question at the back then.
I just would like a quick short view on your commissioning of Australian war artists.
Australian war artists, yes. It's a tradition that's been happening now since the First World War, and I think a very vital position. It's one that cannot be taken lightly because, again, from many who might have seen the Ben Quilty program the other night, it's a test, it's a mental endurance and physical endurance test for the artist, who as the observer, they're there as the observer. They're not there in the luxury of an artist painting what he wants to paint. They have to understand the rules, and they have to clearly be totally concerned with security and danger. So, and these are very important emotions which perhaps in today's internet age we start taking for granted, because the very, very real dangers that exist in the world are blurred on the internet or become games. So places like the Australian War Memorial are testimony to the defining moments in Western history that have created the very thing that I was talking about today, which was the relocation and the transmission of European scholars and artists and designers and engineers and all sorts of incredible people who were ejected from their homelands by Hitler and the fascists. So war and the ravages of war and the terror of war, and you can even go back and think of Goya, I mean, these are, they make us stop in our track, and I think that that's a good thing sometimes.
Well, I don't know where to start. I can't do justice to the knowledge and the names and the depth of understanding that we've just been presented with here. It's been very, very phenomenal. I think we've had description of the art history of Australia, and particularly, I guess, of Victoria, spanning many decades, starting with the refugees from Hitler and his run up to the Second World War, and after the war, of course, all European refugees. And I think that's illustrated too the great influence which the European migrants to Australia brought to our culture and our art here. And Sheridan has covered the spectrum of, I guess, the canvas type artwork to sculpture, architecture, and many others, jewellery, thank you. Almost every facet of art we can imagine is part of her knowledge that she's shared with us today. So it's really been a very phenomenal presentation to all of us, and I think I have no doubt in saying that we're all very grateful for your presentation and the depth of your knowledge, and it's great to know that we have such people in our community that can keep these stories and information available to us. So thank you very much, Sheridan. I'd like you to decorate your home and share this with your family. Another small memento, but more long lasting.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You're quite welcome, of course, to sit and chat for a little bit longer or go out into the lounge room and have a coffee. Actually, have we had coffee yet? I also want to take this opportunity to introduce you to a new staff member who has come in his official title as Secretariat and Content Manager. I thought that was an original title, but it turns out it is used in to describe people who are pretty good at writing and have good understanding of governance and sort of organisational management. His name is Reverend Philip Murphy. Hello, Philip. Do you want to stand up and say hello? And I want to take this opportunity personally to not only further my welcome to you on behalf of the association and the staff, but also to thank Philip. He's only been here 3 weeks, 3.5. And already, whoa, wonderful. I can't tell you how much we're all appreciating his contribution. He comes from Youth Catchment, as the CEO of Youth Catchment, which was a homeless not-for-profit group. They've recently merged. Prior to that, he was an Anglican, or he is still an Anglican priest, but he had his own parishes, 18 years. So he brings also a theological, philosophical and academic bent to this position, which is also wonderfully refreshing and enjoyable to work with. So I hope you'll all welcome him into our community, and I look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you.